Whoopi Goldberg thought she had found the perfect target when actor Jonathan Roumie agreed to appear on her show. The longtime host of The View had been sharpening her critiques for weeks, dismissing Roumie as just another religious conservative actor out of touch with real progress. But what happened over the next 30 minutes left Whoopi visibly shaken, perhaps even ending her reign as an untouchable voice in daytime political media. The stage lights blazed as two of America's most recognizable public figures prepared to face off in what would become the most talked about media confrontation of the year. Goldberg, confident in her home court advantage, had no idea that the quiet, faith-filled actor she planned to mock was about to deliver one of the most devastating intellectual counterattacks daytime television had ever seen. The confrontation had been building for weeks. Goldberg had mocked Roumie's role as Jesus in The Chosen, questioned his political views, and accused him of hiding behind faith to push outdated ideals. She ridiculed his popularity among younger, faith-driven voters, and accused him of being a Trojan horse for right-wing extremism. Her remarks hadn't gone unnoticed. Roumie's team had carefully documented every jab, every mischaracterization, every attempt to reduce a man of depth and principle to a caricature. The irony was striking. Goldberg thought she was preparing to humiliate a well-meaning actor who would fumble under pressure and serve as easy fodder for her progressive audience. Instead, she was offering him a golden platform to show America a different kind of leadership, one rooted not in volume, but in clarity, grace, and truth. But before we dive into this incredible exchange, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because trust me, you won't want to miss what Jonathan Roumie did next. Studio 4A at ABC's New York headquarters crackled with quiet anticipation. Makeup artists applied final touches to two public figures who couldn't have been more different. Whoopi Goldberg, the 69-year-old cultural icon known for her bombastic style and progressive one-liners, sat upright in her chair, flipping through cue cards, confident in the segment to come. Her team had prepped aggressive talking points, clever interruptions, tried and true tactics to rattle even seasoned political veterans. They weren't worried. They thought Roumie, despite his rising popularity among faith-based audiences, was still just an actor, charming maybe, but untested in the lion's den. Across the studio, Jonathan Roumie, 50, sat calmly in the guest chair. Dressed in a charcoal suit with a subtle gold tie, he radiated humility and strength in equal measure. A small wooden cross hung from a chain at his neck, a symbol not just of faith, but of purpose. His preparation hadn't involved media consultants or flashy rehearsals. Instead, he had quietly studied his opponent's tactics, prayed for strength, and armed himself with substance. In his leather satchel were 3 folders, each one a silent warning. The first, a dossier of Goldberg's past inflammatory statements, carefully dated and cross-referenced. The second, detailed social research and public polling to support every argument he might need. The third, sealed and marked only if necessary, a set of documented contradictions that could shatter reputations if forced into use. Everything about Roumie's presence defied the usual spectacle. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to speak truth, to power, yes, but more importantly, to the people. To understand just how shocking what followed would be, you need to know exactly who these two are and what brought them to this moment. Whoopi Goldberg had spent decades in the entertainment industry, rising from stand-up comedy to EGOT status. Her platform on The View had become a daily pulpit from which she shaped progressive opinion. Known for her no-nonsense tone and cutting sarcasm, she had made a career of challenging conservative guests and often dismantling them with ease. In recent years, however, her interviews had taken a sharper turn, mocking faith, ridiculing middle America concerns, and painting dissenters as either misguided or malevolent. She had become less of a host and more of a gatekeeper for what she believed counted as acceptable thought. When she caught wind of Roumie's growing cultural influence, she saw a chance to nip it in the bud. But Jonathan Roumie was not the man Goldberg expected. Born to a Catholic family of Egyptian and Irish descent, raised in New York, and shaped by hardship, Roumie had spent years struggling as a voice actor and production assistant before The Chosen catapulted him into the spotlight. But he hadn't let the fame intoxicate him. Instead, he used it to uplift, to serve, to give voice to the unheard. His public speeches on faith, humility, and human dignity had quietly amassed millions of followers across generational lines. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a pundit. He was something far more difficult to argue with, a man who practiced what he preached. As a man of deep faith and someone who had spent years navigating the harsh realities of the entertainment industry, Jonathan Roumie was no stranger to pressure. He had gone toe-to-toe with network executives, skeptics, and critics who thought a devout Catholic actor couldn't make it in Hollywood without compromising his beliefs. He had learned to stay composed under fire, to think several steps ahead, and, perhaps most importantly, to never allow anyone to define him by their assumptions about religion, status, or ideology. His preparation for this appearance had been meticulous. Roumie's team, small but fiercely dedicated, had compiled opposition research that would put political war rooms to shame. They had dissected Whoopi Goldberg's most controversial on-air moments, her past public statements, her contradictions, everything from video footage to transcripts, even interviews dating back to her early career. They had mapped out her typical interruption patterns, her rhetorical traps, and her moments of greatest vulnerability. But beyond the research, Roumie brought something far more powerful, an authenticity rooted in lived experience. Unlike media personalities who spoke of struggle from a safe distance, Jonathan had walked through it, navigating rejection, anonymity, and financial hardship while clinging to purpose and faith. He knew what it meant to be overlooked, misunderstood, and mocked for his convictions. The stakes could not have been higher. For Goldberg, this was about preserving her reputation as daytime television's unfiltered liberal conscience, someone who could push back against any guest and walk away the winner. A strong performance would reaffirm her dominance and embarrass a rising figure whose quiet influence was beginning to spread into spaces that the media had long ignored. For Roumie, this wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about standing for something greater. This was his opportunity to speak directly to millions, many of whom had never heard a voice like his in this kind of space, and to prove that conviction and grace could defeat cynicism and spectacle, even on the most hostile of stages. The animosity had been brewing for months. Goldberg had repeatedly questioned Roumie's intelligence and relevance on air, mocking his role in The Chosen, and dismissing him as a religious throwback unfit for serious national conversation. She had gone so far as to suggest that his rise in popularity was less about talent and more about white Christian nostalgia. Her producers had aired selectively edited clips of his speeches to paint him as out of touch with modern values. But what Goldberg didn't realize was that her attacks had only strengthened Roumie's resolve. For weeks he had been preparing not just talking points, but a comprehensive moral strategy. He had studied her methods, her contradictions, and the exact moments when her rhetoric lost substance. What neither of them knew, however, was that this confrontation would become more than a clash of worldviews. It would reveal a deeper fracture in American media, a growing divide between those clinging to performative outrage and those offering quiet clarity, between those who believed they could still control the conversation and those ready to redefine it. The countdown clock on the View studio camera ticked to 30 seconds. Both guests took a breath. Goldberg smirked, confident. Roumie closed his eyes for a moment, not out of nerves, but out of habit. He prayed, as he always did before something important. The red light came on. "Welcome back to The View," Goldberg began, her tone sharp with practiced authority. "Today, we are joined by Jonathan Roumie. You may know him as the actor who plays Jesus in The Chosen. But lately, he's been making headlines for his, let's say, controversial opinions about American values. Jonathan, thanks for joining us." The way she lingered on controversial made it clear this wasn't a warm welcome. Roumie appeared on the split screen, serene, eyes calm, posture steady. He had watched countless clips of Goldberg doing exactly this, interrupting, mocking, controlling. But he also knew her rhythm now. He had studied it, and more importantly, he had transcended it. "Whoopi," he began gently, his voice deliberate and measured. "I appreciate the invitation, but I think what you call controversial is often just inconvenient truth." Goldberg blinked. She shuffled her cue cards. "Okay then, let's just get right to it. You're an actor, a religious one. You've never held public office. So tell us, what exactly qualifies you to lecture Americans about politics, society, or justice?" It was classic Goldberg, condescending, performative, and meant to throw him off balance. But Roumie didn't flinch. "With respect," he said, tilting his head slightly, "I don't lecture. I listen. I live among the people who don't have platforms, the working mother in Missouri who can't afford insulin, the teenager in Baltimore trying to stay off the streets. I've sat with them, prayed with them, cried with them. That's what qualifies me to speak. Not fame, not studio lights, just proximity to pain and a refusal to look away. The studio fell into stunned silence. Goldberg narrowed her eyes, but the familiar confidence faltered. She wasn't used to guests who didn't bite the bait, or worse, flipped it back with moral clarity. So, she finally said, trying to regain control, "You're saying experience doesn't matter. You think just because you've walked among everyday people, that gives you more insight than, say, someone who's actually spent decades in activism and media?" Roumie leaned forward ever so slightly. "No, I believe experience absolutely matters. That's why I spent years working behind the scenes, volunteering in shelters, and giving voice to the voiceless. That's why I don't take lightly the responsibility of speaking publicly. The real question is, how much of your experience is grounded in service, and how much is performance for applause?" That landed like thunder. The audience murmured. Goldberg opened her mouth to reply, but for the first time in the segment, she looked rattled, and Jonathan, Roumie, had only just begun. "My experience serving the forgotten matters," Roumie said firmly, looking Whoopi straight in the eye. "The question is whether sitting in television studios, making millions by ridiculing those with less power, truly qualifies someone to speak for the working class of this country." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise instantly. Behind the glass of the control room, producers leaned in toward the monitors, sensing something was happening, something that wasn't in the script. Their host, long known for dominating these confrontations, was now visibly pushed onto the back foot by a guest who showed not even a flicker of fear. Goldberg, unsettled but seasoned, tried to pivot. "All right, Jonathan, since you want to talk about qualifications, let's talk about your record. You've spoken at events opposing mainstream health policy. You've criticized cultural movements many see as progressive gains. Some say your influence is dangerous. How do you justify that to the young people watching who want to move forward, not backward?" It was classic Whoopi, framing complex debates into emotional traps, portraying conviction as regression. But Roumie was not unprepared. "Let's be clear about what you're calling dangerous," he replied, his voice steady but sharp. "Do you mean advocating for religious liberty? Speaking out against child exploitation in media? Defending the importance of the nuclear family in a society collapsing from loneliness and isolation?" She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued, voice rising slightly, not in volume but in presence. "Because if we're talking about dangerous policies, let's look at the platforms that profit from division. Let's talk about the people who call themselves progressives but profit from cultural decay. Let's talk about how this very show spent years mocking faith, masculinity, and tradition, while pretending to speak for the voiceless." In the audience, many of them producers, publicists, and invited progressives. The energy shifted. They had expected a sermonizing actor to get exposed. Instead, they were witnessing someone flip every attack into a quiet triumph of conviction. Goldberg now looked rattled. Her default tricks weren't working, so she tried what she thought was a safer move. "Let's talk about crime," she said, leaning in. "You oppose stricter police measures in areas where violence is rising. How do you explain that to mothers living in fear?" Roumie didn't even pause. "Whoopi, do you know what it's like to walk into a neighborhood and not be able to tell the difference between neglect and punishment?" he asked gently. "Crime isn't a statistic to me. I've prayed over bodies. I've counseled young men who felt forgotten long before they ever picked up a weapon." He reached slowly for his folder and held up a sheet of printed data. "In the neighborhoods I work with, where we've invested in mentorship, not just punishment, violent crime is actually decreasing. Not because we locked more people up, but because we showed up." He paused, then delivered what would become the most shared quote of the night. "The difference between you and me, Whoopi, is that you talk about crime to scare people into silence. I talk about crime because I've held its victims. This isn't a ratings game to me." There was a sharp silence, then a crackle of nervous shifting from the camera crew. For a split second, Whoopi's face flashed with something almost like panic, not because of the words, but because of what she saw in Roumie's eyes. Calm certainty, not fury, not bravado. Something much more dangerous to her narrative, moral clarity. And Roumie wasn't done. "You know what, Whoopi," he said, leaning slightly forward in a way that made the studio feel like a courtroom. "Let's talk about why I'm really here. It's not because you wanted a fair conversation. It's because you assume that someone like me, a faith-driven man with convictions you can't easily mock, would crumble under your spotlight. He didn't blink. But I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to remind your viewers that it's possible to disagree with the cultural elite and still love people fiercely, that it's possible to believe in eternal truth and still care deeply about the present. Goldberg opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The woman who had grilled presidents, made billionaires squirm, and brought studio audiences to their feet with one biting line was frozen. Her hand moved, barely, to reach for her water glass, and the camera, as if guided by instinct, zoomed in slightly to catch it, a slight tremble. Roumie saw it too. Years of studying body language on set and reading real pain in real people had trained him to recognize a breaking point. And now he pressed forward. "You want to question my record?" he said, pulling out the second folder from his satchel. "Fine, let's talk about yours." Goldberg's brow furrowed. "Excuse me," she began, but Roumie raised his hand, not forcefully, just confidently, and the studio fell into a reverent hush. "No, Whoopi, I let you speak. Now it's my turn." The control room erupted in chaos. Producers were gesturing wildly, cut to commercial flashing across multiple screens. But Goldberg didn't signal. She sat still, or perhaps simply stunned, and Roumie opened the file. June 12, 2017, he began. "You accuse millions of Americans of being complicit in hatred simply for voting differently than you. September 2020, you minimized religious belief as an outdated superstition on this very program. December 22, you mocked a teenage girl for expressing concern over moral decay in her school. Do I need to continue?" He didn't need to, because in that moment, the balance of power had completely shifted. Roumie continued, his voice calm but firm, the discipline of years in faith and performance evident in every word. "You've built your brand on division, Whoopi, on fear, on making one group of Americans afraid of another. You've told working families that their struggles are caused by people just like them, when the truth is it's the powerful few who manipulate us all." The camera cut to Goldberg's face, flushed with anger, her expression tight, her fingers wrapped around a pen so hard her knuckles had turned white. This woman, who had once commanded audiences with her wit and confidence, now sat visibly shaken, unable to find her footing. But Jonathan Roumie was only just beginning. He reached into his bag and pulled out a slim brown folder, the one he'd saved for this precise moment. "You like to talk about accountability," Roumie said, opening the folder with quiet finality. "So let's talk about yours." Goldberg's eyes widened. She shifted in her chair. "Let's talk about your public dismissal of deeply held religious beliefs," he said. "Let's talk about the time you trivialized a young woman's testimony about faith-based harassment. Let's talk about how, for years, you've mocked, marginalized, and misrepresented people who don't fit your view of progress." He flipped to a page and began reading, his tone now that of a seasoned prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "October 2018, you claimed Christianity was a danger to women's rights. February 21, you dismissed conscience objections as medieval thinking. July 2022, you laughed off concerns about parental rights in schools, calling them hysteria. Shall I go on?" The studio went dead silent. Even the cameramen, seasoned veterans used to showbiz storms, stood still. Goldberg, a titan of daytime television for decades, had never been spoken to like this. Not on her set, not in front of her team, not by someone who refused to blink. Her voice, when it returned, was a pale shadow of its usual thunder. "Those were taken out of context," she muttered weakly. Roumie smiled, not smugly, but like a man who had just heard the confession he didn't need to ask for. "Out of context?" he repeated. "Whoopi, there's no context that makes mocking faith acceptable. No context that makes minimizing the pain of survivors okay. No context that makes it right to shame people simply for not believing what you believe." Then he leaned forward slightly, his gaze now directed into the camera. "And this," he said, "this is what I want every viewer watching right now to understand. This isn't about me. This is about truth. This is about a new generation of Americans, young and old, religious and secular, who are tired of being silenced by people who preach tolerance but practice mockery. We're not afraid anymore. We're not playing along anymore. And we are done letting bullies with microphones rewrite what's sacred." The moment was electric. Roumie hadn't just survived a hostile interview, he had claimed it. The stage designed to corner him had become a pulpit for moral clarity. The host, known for skewering guests, now sat quietly, stunned into silence. But he wasn't finished. "You want to know what qualifies me to speak on national television?" he asked, slowly rising to full rhetorical height. "It's not my resume, though I'm proud of my work. It's that I've never forgotten what it means to be unseen. I know what it means to pray for rent, to be turned away, to be mocked for believing there's something higher than ratings or applause." He paused, just long enough. "The difference between us, Whoopi, is that I entered the public eye to serve people who disagree with me and people who don't. You've used your platform to attack people who don't look like you or think like you. That's why, when the credits roll, I walk out of this studio with peace, and you walk out with a question you don't want to answer." A full 10 seconds of silence followed. Goldberg didn't respond. Couldn't. When she finally whispered, "We'll be right back," it sounded like a surrender. The show cut to commercial. Behind the scenes, the control room was in free fall. Producers were on phones with ABC execs, scrambling to manage the fallout. Footage from studio cameras showed Goldberg slumped in her chair, shaking her head in disbelief. Roumie, by contrast, sat calmly, quietly checking his notes as if he had just wrapped a routine appearance. The contrast was devastating. Her makeup had to be redone entirely to cover the stress and perspiration. Roumie hadn't touched his. He looked just as he had when he walked in, steady, composed, untouchable. When the show resumed, Goldberg tried to push through a few more questions. Roumie answered with grace, clarity, and unshakable poise, landing several more points that left the host floundering. When it was all over, Goldberg gave the most half-hearted thank you of her career. Roumie just smiled. "Thanks for having me, Whoopi," he said warmly. "This was a gift. Let's do it again sometime." As the cameras cut, chaos erupted. Producers were fielding media calls. Social media lit up with clips and commentary. On X, formerly Twitter, #Roumie Rex The View was trending within 15 minutes. What had begun as a high-profile ambush had become one of the most humiliating takedowns in television history. And the man who delivered it didn't raise his voice once. The first video to go viral was a 2-minute supercut titled "Jonathan Roumie Silences Whoopi Goldberg, a Masterclass in Moral Clarity." Within the first hour, it surpassed 500,000 views across X, Instagram, and YouTube. By morning, the number had soared past 15 million, dominating every trending list on social media. Twitter, now X, was the first battlefield where the cultural earthquake shook hardest. Within 30 minutes, hashtags like #Jonathan Roumie, #Truth on the View, and #New Moral Leadership were trending worldwide. Reactions followed expected political lines, but the sheer scale was unprecedented. Conservative Christians, centrists, and even some disillusioned progressives flooded timelines with praise. Clips were shared with captions like, "This is what speaking truth with grace looks like. Finally, someone who brings light, not heat. You don't need to shout when you have the truth on your side." The tweet that ignited the wildfire came from actor Chris Pratt, who shared the final monologue clip with a simple line. "You don't have to agree with everything he says, but you can't deny that this man just reshaped the game." It received over 250,000 likes in under 2 hours. Even more surprising was the reaction from unexpected quarters. Trevor Noah posted a clip with the caption, "I've seen politicians break on this show. I've never seen a guest break the host before." And perhaps most shocking, Bill Maher tweeted, "I disagree with most of what Jonathan Roumie believes, but that wasn't a conversation. That was a reckoning." That comment sparked a firestorm in Maher's own replies, with some accusing him of betrayal, others praising his honesty. But it was clear, the moment had transcended the usual left-right divide. The internal fallout at ABC was immediate and brutal. Network executives who had built The View into a fortress of daytime opinion were stunned. Seeing Whoopi Goldberg, a media icon, visibly shaken and outmatched on her own stage sent shockwaves across the company. Emergency calls were made. Programming meetings were rescheduled. Rumors swirled that the show's producers were under pressure to rethink their entire format and even consider rotating out permanent hosts. Whoopi tried to control the narrative with a single tweet, had a passionate dialogue with Jonathan Roumie today. "Agree or not, it's always good to hear all sides." But the public wasn't buying it. Replies were brutal. That wasn't a dialogue, that was a disarmament. Calling that passionate is like calling the Titanic a rough cruise. On the political front, faith-based organizations and independent grassroots groups lit up overnight. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, Roumie's nonprofit initiatives saw record donations. Volunteer signups for pro-life centers, addiction recovery programs, and youth mentorship organizations surged across the country. The real kicker came from swing state polling groups who ran focus groups in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona the following week. Even among moderate and left-leaning voters, Roumie's favorability jumped significantly. One independent voter in Pennsylvania said, "I don't agree with his religion, but man, I trust him more than any of these politicians." Even mainline Catholics and evangelicals, long hesitant to engage politically, began citing the interview as a moment that gave them hope that someone could represent their values with dignity. Media critics and journalism schools pounced. Articles in Columbia Journalism Review and Pointer described the interview as a textbook example of what happens when entertainment masks as journalism and meets actual preparation. Professors from Notre Dame and Liberty University both assigned the exchange and communication ethics courses, contrasting Roumie's evidence-based delivery with Goldberg's emotional improvisation. Some cultural analysts began drawing historical parallels. This was 1960 Nixon versus Kennedy, but in reverse. Goldberg had the studio, Roumie had the people. The long-term implications quickly became clear. Booking agents reported that Christian and conservative guests who previously avoided hostile shows were now calling to be placed on The View, and others like it, armed with the Roumie strategy. Political consultants, especially in red-leaning swing districts, were circulating internal memos with subject lines like, "Study Roumie's calm under fire. This is how we win Gen Z." Hollywood producers began speculating about Roumie's long-term future, not just as an actor or spiritual voice, but as a potential cultural bridge in an era defined by division. What had begun as a classic gotcha segment had become a turning point in American media, not because Jonathan Roumie yelled louder or played dirtier, but because he didn't. He refused to take the bait, and in doing so, reset the rules of engagement. Political science professors across the country began incorporating the Whoopi Goldberg interview into their syllabi, not as a partisan case, but as a masterclass in composure, clarity, and moral persuasion under pressure. Law schools followed suit. At Georgetown, Notre Dame, and even Yale, professors invited Roumie to speak about how courtroom discipline and spiritual conviction could transform a media moment into a cultural turning point. His ability to maintain calm under hostile questioning, to respond with facts instead of fire, and to dismantle an entrenched media figure without ever raising his voice became a landmark case study in applied ethics and communication strategy. But the impact didn't stop at U.S. borders. International news outlets covered the interview extensively, framing it as a sign of changing winds in American discourse. The BBC aired a segment titled "The Actor Who Redefined Media Integrity on Live Television." France 24 and ZDF in Germany analyzed the moment as part of a broader generational shift, a rejection of confrontational punditry in favor of principled conviction and preparation. Foreign commentators took note of how Roumie's calm, rooted presence stood in contrast to the increasingly performative nature of Western media. In a world of heat, here was a man of light. One Italian columnist wrote, "He did not beat the host with better insults. He defeated her with truth, and that is far more dangerous." Perhaps most importantly, the interview changed the expectations for public communication in the U.S. Young political staffers, spiritual influencers, and even nonprofit leaders began retraining their spokespeople, not just to survive hostile questions, but to turn those ambushes into altars where truth could speak. The old playbook, stay on message, avoid conflict, placate the host, was gone. Roumie had proven that you didn't have to play defense if you knew your values well enough to stand on them. As the weeks passed, one truth became undeniable. This was not just a good night for an actor on daytime television. It was the arrival of a new style of cultural engagement, a style that refused to beg for media attention, that refused to play victim, that refused to apologize for having values. And it worked. 3 months later, The View was quietly shifted to a less favorable time slot. Jonathan Roumie, meanwhile, was invited to host a special primetime town hall on a major network titled Faith, Freedom, and the Future. The student hadn't just challenged the teacher, he had replaced her. For American culture and media, the message was clear. A new generation of voices had arrived, and they weren't here to follow the script. They were here to write their own. And Roumie proved they didn't need to shout to be heard. They didn't need to conform to win. They just needed to stand for something true. The final word came from Roumie himself in a quiet but powerful tweet posted exactly 1 week after the interview aired. To everyone who asked if I was nervous going on that show, I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. There's a difference, and it's everything. That tweet perfectly captured what made his performance not only devastating, but deeply inspiring. In an era of sound bites, he brought substance. In a time of spin, he brought sincerity. And in a media landscape addicted to noise, he proved that truth, spoken with grace, still cuts the deepest. The interview may have ended Whoopi Goldberg's reign as an untouchable daytime figure. But more than that, it redrew the battlefield of cultural communication, proving that the old assumptions about who holds power in televised conversation were not just wrong, but dangerously outdated. If this moment moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink the power of truth in a hostile world, don't leave without hitting that subscribe button. We're just getting started uncovering the voices that refuse to be silenced and the leaders who rise where others fall. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful stories. Let's build a community that values substance over spin and courage over conformity. Your voice matters, your attention matters, and together we're raising the standard.